Hello everyone, Richard Cowling here from Cape St. Francis. The theme of this talk is the way in which nature can strike back at humans when they do not plan their towns and villages that take into consideration nature's flows, particularly in response to unusual climate events like storms. And here we're talking about flows of water, flows of sand. So I will be using the Greater St. Francis region as an example to make this point. It's an area that I've been familiar with, at least being able to begin to understand and observe changes over nearly half a century. Okay, so this is our study area. It's a bit of a crowded slide, but I'll take you through it. What we're seeing here is the coastline between Oyster Bay and the mouth of the Crom River, a distance as the crow flies of probably about 20-25 kilometers. We have along the coast a series of what we call half-heart bays. The bay itself forms one lobe of a heart, so I suppose that's why they're called half-heart bays. We can see another one here, and then of course the massive St. Francis Bay, which is a huge half-heart bay. The other thing we have to bear in mind is that the longshore drift, which carries most of the sediment that is deposited in these bays, moves from west to east. When the longshore drift encounters one of these points sticking out of this half-heart bay, the strength of the current diminishes and a lot of sand is deposited into this bay. With rising sea levels, that sand can be pushed ashore and then blown across the promontory into the next bay. And these we call headland bypass dunes. The Oyster Bay one, which arises on the beach at Oyster Bay, is the biggest and extends all the way across the two promontories here into St. Francis Bay, where it almost, from the earliest photographs, we'll see it almost reached the sea. What's important about these dune systems is that in the western part of the system, at their origin, it appears that wind drives the formation of the dunes. Extremely strong winds right throughout the year, but particularly the southwesterly winds drive the formation of dunes. The same would apply to Tace Pint. However, once one gets over a central rise along these dune fields, which are associated with the mountains, the Titicaca Mountains. These are the coastal extension of these mountains, which here only appear as two parallel ridges associated with each of these points. These get up to about 100 meters high, so the dune field is blown by wind up to about this point. When the terrain starts leveling off and dropping, the actual power of the wind declines. And it would appear that from about this point onwards, the dune movement is driven not by wind so much as by water. So episodic flooding events here take huge amounts of sediment and carry them down into these beaches. An interesting dune field here, the Santorim dune field, which has been entirely stabilized, It is often seen as part of this tacepint dune field that is separated from it because of vegetation stabilization in between these two tongues of sand. But that may not be the case. As I'll talk a little later, it could well be that this area is, that sand movement in this area is also driven by water movement after floods. Okay, so here we can see our area from the air in a photograph taken back in 1942. We can see the features we've talked about in the previous slide. Here is the Oyster Bay dune field, still open to sand, blowing up from the beach, running all the way to near the mouth of the Crom, where it looks like a recent or an event had brought the sand almost to the river mouth. There's the Tacepint dune field, the Santorim dune field. This is Cape St. Francis. Seal Point. There's Cape St. Francis. That's where Santorim, this is where Santorim Bay would have been. The other interesting feature about this slide is that there's very little sign of human impact at this stage. The Forestry Department had started growing alien plants for stabilizing the dunes in response to concerns from farmers here that their land was being encroached by dunes, which really wasn't strictly true. And also planted a little bit here at Cape St. Francis. That sort of dark color there would be roycrots that they probably distributed to lighthouse owners or who knows. Anyway, the fact is that there was very little sign of where humans, of human habitation or farming in this area. The upper parts of the old village of St. Francis Bay, but anything north of Lime Road area would have been problematic in the sense it would have been vulnerable to flooding, so no people there. And then, of course, quite a bit of habitation on the other side of the dune field towards the Crom estuary, which also would have been a relatively stable place. So this is what it looks now in 2024, our study region. We can see all the landmarks that we've seen in the previous slide. We can also see the dune fields. But what's important to note is how smaller the area of dune has become, how the dune fields have been cut off from their sources on the beaches. Most of this encroachment is due to alien plants, which were planted or established on the edges of these dune fields. Of course, the other thing that is hugely different is the extent of human footprint in terms of urban area. Look at all of these regions plonked here, grid-like almost, in a stripe along the coast, maximizing views, heading back into the dune field, this over here, another strip along here. And this planning and township development has not been mindful in any substantive way of the processes that underlie these kinds of landscapes, of the movement of water down towards the coast, where it erupts in several places as the water flow hits bedrock and comes to the surface. We have to remember this dune field, other than the Sand River, a very minor river that flows from about here through the dune field, other than that Sand River, which has its origins outside of the dune field, there are no other drainage lines. So as that wad of sand fills up with water, it starts overflowing, just like if you fill a glass with water and to overflowing. And that water's got to come somewhere, and it tends to pop out close to the coast where all the development is. So the first sort of holiday resort development in this area was Leighton Hewlett in the late 1950s. Built these simple rondavels, holiday cottages, very low key and low impact development. And you can see that it was in that part of St. Francis Bay. There's the homestead, that was where the Hewlett family lived. But it was in that part of St. Francis Bay. I mean, the bottle store is probably about here. This is the garage, would be there. Where it was feasible to have some kind of infrastructure, because this is an area, one of the few areas in the region that isn't vulnerable. And in many respects, the development should not have expanded much beyond places like this. Small clusters of homes in areas that are secure in terms of the exposure to forces of sand and sea. Have a look at the sediment budgets in our region prior to the stabilization of dunes. So just to orientate you again, that is Cape St. Francis. This is St. Francis Bay. That's the Santorini dune field. That's the early development at Cape St. Francis, as it was known then. This is pre-1975. There is some stabilization of this dune field here, but essentially the Santorini dune field is still intact. So at that time, about 10,000 cubic meters of sand per year came around this point, Cape St. Francis. About 10,000 cubic meters came into the bay from the small bypass dune field in the Cape St. Francis Nature Reserve. And it's really important that we keep this bypass dune functioning, because it at least is bringing some additional sediment other than that which comes around the point. And then, of course, the Santorini dune field was responsible for the lion's share of the sediment budget, contributing about 90,000 cubics of sand a year. Just note here how this plume almost got to the coast sometime prior to 1941, and here we can see the start of the canal system at St. Francis Bay. So what did it look like on the ground? Well, at the top you see two pictures taken of the beach at St. Francis Bay back in the mid to late 1960s. You can see the whole Santorini dune field is still intact, whereas this minor plume here has already been stabilized. Here is the beach round about Ann Avenue, magnificent extent of beach. And the big picture with the surfers is in front of the reef, the main break at St. Francis in those days, and still is in many respects, but the shape of the wave was so much better when there was lots of sand around. So between 1975 and 1985, the dunes were stabilized largely by placing cut branches of rooikrans over the sand and thereby creating a dense thicket of rooikrans, which effectively stopped any sand. This is what the Santorim dune field looks like today. It's stabilized with housing or alien plants. This stabilization has resulted in an 80% reduction of sand supply into St. Francis Bay. And what that has meant is that the bay itself has been depleted of sand. So work that Dylan Anderson did for his master's showed that about 9 million cubic meters of sand had been transported eastwards, scoured out of the bay. So the supply of sand in the bay has been dramatically reduced by the stabilization of the dunes, and that of course has had a major impact on the extent of the beach here at St. Francis Bay. So between 1975 and 1985, in a study done by Roy Lubke, it was shown that the beach retreated between 0.5 and 3 meters a year. So it was a period within a decade that St. Francis Bay lost its beach forever. The same thing happened at Cape St. Francis. This was a dune, a mobile dune that spread virtually to the sea on Rocky Coast. It was quite broad. You can see that a lot of acacia cyclops had been planted, and I think this goes back to the 1930s already, in an attempt to ensure that there was access to the lighthouse. And then you can see here where there are other blowouts, natural blowouts, that already attempts are being made to stabilize the dunes there. This is the main car park at Cape St. Francis. Here is Barcelona Avenue, and so on and so forth. You can see down at the bottom of all of these roads were very large blowouts that contained also large amounts of sand that were available to replenish this beach. But these were, by the early 1970s, these were already being stabilized. Some landowners exacerbated the problem by stabilizing the semi-mobile dunes in front of them, which further entrapped a whole lot of sand. So in 1982, Cape St. Francis had this really lovely wide beach that remained fairly stable until the fairly late 2010s, associated with the stabilization of those last frontal dunes. So look at what the beach looks like now. This was taken in 2020. Both photos were taken at low tide. So messing around with frontal dunes, messing around with headland bypass dunes is always going to incur some kind of cost. Also impacted by this narrowing of the beach were the canals. This picture taken, I think, somewhere in the late 1970s. And the beach is already beginning to narrow over here. Here's the entrance to the canal system, right near the mouth, which is illegal. It should never have been allowed. The legislation that goes back to the turn of the last century about what you can and can't do near river mouths. Anyway, this canal was dredged here, and you could see that the sand that was dredged to make the canal was placed here to create this berm. And let's see how things progress with the narrowing of the beach. Here we see the canal close to the sea during a huge storm. This is one of those times when we get gale force southeasterly winds and massive southerly to southeasterly swells. These aren't just wind swells, these are swells generated by things happening far, far away in the Southern Ocean. And there is the berm, which has to protect these canals from an eroding beach. So as the beach starts eroding, attempts are made to reduce impacts by piling large amounts of rock, but eventually the sea breaks through and the whole channel of the river, the channel between the sea and the estuary, is shifted towards the western side of the Crom. This has created a new energy regime within the Crom, and of course has made the whole, within the canals, it has made the whole canal system hugely more vulnerable to any future storms. So often you hear people say, oh well, we didn't know, we never knew it would be bad, no one warned us, you know, this was all done in good faith. And that's true up to a point in the Cape St. Francis and Francis Bay area. But Ken Tinley, this man in this photograph shown here with his two kids somewhere on the Mozambique coast, was someone who had seen, who had documented the problems associated with stabilizing dunes. And he picked up this information while he was the chief ecologist for Mozambique over about 5 or 6 years back in the late 60s, early 70s. And he showed quite clearly that planting casuarina trees all over mobile dunes, particularly bypass dunes, had created huge problems in terms of erosion. And Ken came to visit me, I think in 1980 or thereabouts, when I was living in St. Francis Bay. And I arranged for him to give a talk in the Cape St. Francis Hotel, as it was then, to everyone there, to explain what had happened in Mozambique and indeed what would likely happen at St. Francis Bay. So people there, including Leighton Hewlett, would have got a very strong message that what was happening now was going to create a problem in the future. So it wasn't a question of not knowing, but clearly by that stage things were probably so financially entwined that any opportunity to bail out of the program would have been absolutely unacceptable. Okay, so we have a rather brittle situation. The coastline is extremely vulnerable because of human interference with the flows of sand, things that maybe people didn't anticipate would have such a dramatic effect, but certainly have. Let's now have a look at how this vulnerable situation interacts with unusual climate events. And we're going to be speaking specifically about cut-off lows, because cut-off lows are extremely important sources of or causes of floods in our region. So this is a a climate map of the Southern Ocean. Here's the outline of South Africa. And what's happened is one of these lows, and by the way, this is in August, so it's getting towards spring, and these cut-off lows tend to happen mostly during the spring and autumn periods. So here we have, we have a low, these lows that come across and sweep the coast, bringing the westerly winds. But here's one of these lows that has been cut off by this huge ridging high. So a high has come in between these two low pressure systems and cut this one off. Okay. And what that does, and the high can then remain, this low can remain quite stationary. What it does is it pulls in a lot of moisture off the warm Agulhas current, but it also pulls down from Central Africa, from Angola and the Congo, it pulls down moist air. So you're getting two sources of moist air, and this low can remain fairly stationary, and huge amounts of rain can fall various places along the coast and slightly inland over a few days, amounts of up to 400 millimeters. So these cut-off lows are associated with massive amounts of rainfall, and the predictions are that with climate change, these sorts of events that result in an interaction between the temperate low pressure systems and the tropical low pressure systems, these sorts of events are going to increase, and more of these floods can be expected. So after these sorts of rainfall events, as we can see here, this picture was taken in 2011, I think it was, the dune field just fills up. So water comes to the surface everywhere, particularly where there's any rock or impermeable surface, and it builds up in these dams. And if the dams get too full, they break. And so water tends to move the sand downstream. This is in the Oyster Bay dune fields. It's in the part of the dune field closer to St. Francis Bay. It's sloping down towards the Crom, and the sand movement is driven largely by episodic flooding events. Here's another picture of the same event after huge amounts of rain. Towards the lower part of the photograph, we can see the Lynx development here in its fairly early stages. Here is a dam that they've built. There's water pouring out of this system, pouring into these dams, and water moving down here and also here, the Sand River coming in about there and flowing through the dune field. So this whole dune system is now saturated, and it's starting to disgorge its water. So what happens? You get the dams which either man-made or natural fill up with water and they fail. And then you get massive flows, almost debris flows, water flows that cause huge problems. This is the R330 after the 2011 flood next to the Lynx. This is a place inside the Lynx. And then this water moves into the village of St. Francis Bay. All the low-lying ground to the north of Lime Road North is all vulnerable. And you can see here huge amounts of water right at the surface. That is the fire station there, the municipal lads with the recycling there. This is St. Francis Bay, St. Francis Drive, just before you get to Lime Road North, George Road intersection. Also low-lying ground, flood water develops on these areas. They form huge ponds behind the frontal dunes, and you have a problem. So the Sand River also floods. The only proper drainage channel through the system. It receives moisture, water from all the surrounding dunes, and those flood waters can cause problems, as we can see here. Sand River has washed away the bridge. The 2011 floods, I think it was. The bridge has been replaced by one that can presumably or hopefully withstand these sorts of events. This is the impact of the Sand River attempting to migrate southwards, digging out a big channel just in front of Sunset Ride on the canals. We need to bear in mind that the Sand River fluctuated. Its mouth, or where it ran into the Crom estuary, varied from about where the bridge is now all the way up to near the mouth at St. Francis Bay. So it's not a stable feature near the mouth of the Crom estuary. So it's not a stable feature at all. So the Sand River in flood carries a huge amount of sediment, and here we can see the sort of fan of sediment that it produced, that it disgorged into the Crom estuary after the floods of 2012. This is just a view, an early view, or a view of the early development in the canal system. So this is where the main marina used to be, at the bottom of Shore Road. Note the huge wetland behind the existing canal system, which has all been dredged for canals. These wetlands would have acted as a buffer to moisture coming from the dunes down towards the sea. So there's nothing to buffer that moisture now, and this has made this whole area far more vulnerable to flood events than in its pristine state. The Santorini dune fields also have their problems. This picture is looking east. Here's Santorini. This is the air park. And here is flooding occurring extensively in the stabilized area of the Santorini dune field. So again, moisture moving towards the coast from inland, strikes bedrock or calcrete or something like that, is brought to the surface and collects in these massive dams, and eventually these dams fail. So there's a house in Santorini. This is a dam that failed, or a natural dam that just overflowed. Eventually the sand gave way, and off it went down the hill at Santorini. This is Harbour Road. This is closer to the harbour, where there was a massive amount of flow that eroded away lots of infrastructure. Apparently some drainage stuff has been put in. There are pipes and various interventions to prevent this happening again. and we certainly do hope that is the case. A similar thing happens at Cape St. Francis. So here the moisture is probably moving that way, down towards the sea. There's a dune ridge here against which the water is damming, but it's still, some of it is moving downstream. And where it erupts close to the sea, it also causes destruction. This is the Seal Bay Nature Reserve. These are some of the paths which were underwater by a couple of centimeters. These are areas along De Hoop. This is an area along De Hoop Single next to a big interdune plain, which also gets waterlogged if you have excessive rainfall events. So also in Cape St. Francis, we have problems with drainage and with flooding events. So if we go back to how it looked like in 1942, we can then see what mistakes we made and how we would do things differently if we got another chance. And certainly what one would need to consider is the dynamic underpinnings of this whole landscape. You wouldn't have touched these dunes at all. You would have restricted development to the little nodes like here, up there, over there, some places here, maybe along here. Nodes that are relatively stable over centuries periods, because these are the places that are likely to be most resilient to the problems that we're going to encounter in the future. But it's not really helpful to say, well, this is how we would have done it differently. What we need to do is figure out how we're going to deal with it now. And there's two things that I think we have to bear in mind. The first is that we're going to have to face the costs of considerable infrastructure to lessen the damages that are anticipated by unwise planning in our region. Already we know that large amounts of money are being spent on attempts to try and improve the beach situation at St. Francis Bay, but money will need to be spent on the drainage infrastructure there, in particular in many of the low-lying areas, and the same applies to Cape St. Francis. And then the other thing is we just cannot allow more development in these sorts of low-lying areas that are vulnerable. It's just, who's going to pay? If we're going to put in the infrastructure there that's going to keep those places relatively safe, should we not be investing it in places where we still haven't done it? So we really need to focus on reducing development density in vulnerable places. Okay, so the good news here is that over the last 30, 40 years or so, large areas of this region of our greater Cape St. Francis area are under conservation management. The bits that Foster manages here, Rocky Coast Farm, Rebels Riss, Tulamoya, these are all, the Sand River, these are all nature reserves that have been developed since the start of the development here in the 1950s. They don't, other than the Cape St. Francis Nature Reserve, which is really important in keeping this headland bypass dune active, none of these reserves really do a good job in terms of protecting infrastructure from the effects of flood events and so on and so forth. If that were the case, we would have a series of reserves that ran along this direction and took up the distal ends or the leading ends of all of these dunes if we had planned with nature. But we haven't. We've planned against nature, and now we have to face the consequences. But at least we have a number of places, number of nature reserves which do contribute to helping us deal with the kind of environmental problems that we will face in the future. Thank you.